From legal wife beating to owning slaves, here are 10 brutal Viking laws that we consider normal today. Number 10. Trial by combat. In modern times, we have lawyers who argue in court on behalf of their clients. But back in the days of the Vikings, they had a different way of settling disputes. Instead of letting lawyers do the talking, they let the fighters do the talking for them. Known as trial by combat, this was a way of settling arguments, usually over land or women, where two people would fight each other until one of them died or gave up. It wasn't necessarily a fair fight either, because the Vikings loved to spice things up. Sometimes a trial by combat would take place between an accused person and their accuser, with the person being accused only having the right to defend themselves. Other times, the odds would be stacked against a person, with them having to fight not just one opponent but 3 at the same time. Obviously it was very dangerous, but this was the Viking way of doing things. As far as they were concerned, the gods decided the outcome of such fights, so it was better to trust in Odin than to trust in lawyers. 9. Legal wife beating. One of the biggest changes between the modern world and the Viking world is the role of women. In modern society, we strive for gender equality, though we haven't quite reached it yet. But in Viking society, women were treated as second-class citizens. It didn't matter if you were a woman of high status or a lowly peasant, your life was still going to be pretty hard. For one, you could be sold to a creepy old man as a bride. And then once married, you could be beaten legally by your husband. Yes, the Vikings actually passed laws that allowed men to beat their wives. The worst part about it all was that there were no consequences for the husband. If he killed his wife in a fit of rage, he wouldn't even go to jail. He'd probably get away with murder. Literally, to make matters worse, if the wife fought back against her attacker, she would be charged with assaulting her husband and taken to court. Talk about a double standard. Number 8. No drowning your sorrows. Even though they weren't known for their compassion, the Vikings did know how to have fun. Drinking parties were common, and drinking games were popular among both adults and children. But if you thought you could drink to excess and then jump into the ocean to sober up, you'd be sorely mistaken. During the Viking Age, there was a law against drowning your sorrows. It was considered a sin to swim after drinking. And if you broke the law, you could be arrested and put on trial. What made this law especially weird was the fact that drowning yourself in alcohol was not forbidden. After all, the Vikings loved to party. Also, swimming itself was not banned. Many Vikings enjoyed taking dips in rivers and lakes, especially during the hot summers. Only when these two activities were combined was there trouble. According to legend, the law came about after a farmer drowned while trying to retrieve a barrel of ale that had fallen into a river. Feeling guilty, the gods enacted the law to prevent such tragedies from happening again. 7. Women could only own property through marriage. Another example of how women were viewed by Viking men can be seen in their property laws. You see, a woman could own property, but only if she was married. If she was single, any property she owned would be transferred to her father upon her death, who would then pass it on to her brothers. This meant that women couldn't own property in their own name. Everything they owned had to be registered in the name of someone else. It also meant that women were seen more as commodities than human beings. They were little more than pieces of property themselves, passed around from father to husband. To add insult to injury, if a woman's husband died, she would lose all of her property and revert back to being under the control of her father. The only exception to this rule was for widows who had sons, as they were allowed to keep their property until their sons came of age. 6. No false accusations. If you thought making false accusations was a problem in modern society, just wait till you hear what the Vikings had to say about it. Back in the day, if you falsely accused someone of committing a crime, you would face stiff penalties. Not only would you be fined, but you'd also be publicly shamed. And if the accusation was deemed malicious, you could be thrown in jail. It wasn't uncommon for people to be locked up for accusing others of witchcraft. In fact, a person could be accused of practicing witchcraft simply for being different. If someone didn't like how a certain person dressed or acted, or if they had a different set of beliefs, they could accuse them of being a witch. Though it's important to note that the Vikings weren't exactly bigots. While some communities did persecute Christians for their beliefs, other communities allowed Christians to live freely within their borders. 5. Slaves had no rights. Slavery isn't uncommon in history. From the ancient Egyptians to the American colonists, humans have always found ways to enslave other humans, and the Vikings were no exception. But what sets Viking slavery apart from other forms of slavery is the fact that slaves were considered the property of the king. In most slave societies, slaves were owned by individuals or families, but in Viking society, the king was the ultimate slave owner. If the king confiscated a group of slaves, he would divide them among his thanes, or nobles, as a reward for their service. The thanes then had the right to use their slaves as they saw fit, treating them like animals rather than people. What's especially cruel is that slaves weren't necessarily people from distant lands. The Vikings also enslaved people from their own communities. Farmers and laborers could be turned into slaves if they fell behind on their taxes. A family could even sell one of its members into slavery if they were desperate for money. 4. No robbing fellow Christians. It seems odd to think that the Vikings were ever concerned about robbing fellow Christians, considering the lengths they went to in order to pillage Christian monasteries. But don't forget that Christianity was introduced to Scandinavia later in the Viking Age, which means that many Vikings never really embraced the religion. But those Vikings who did convert to Christianity were forbidden from robbing fellow Christians. This law was put in place to prevent Viking raids from turning into full-scale invasions. After all, there's nothing worse than having your tax-paying subjects robbed by rival European nobles. So while Vikings could plunder anyone who wasn't Christian, they couldn't rob fellow Christians without facing serious consequences. 3. Sons could kill their fathers. Family must be everything, right? Well, not if you're a Viking. Back in the Viking Age, a son could kill his father without facing any criminal charges. How messed up is that? To make matters even weirder, a father could also be killed by his wife or his mother. In fact, family members were the only people who could get away with killing other people without consequence. Even kings weren't safe from their own relatives. Remember Eric Bloodaxe, the infamous Viking warrior? He was killed by his own son Hessen after ruling over the Kingdom of York for only 3 years. 2. Trial by ordeal. When the Vikings weren't using trial by combat to settle disputes, they were using trial by ordeal. This was another popular method of determining whether someone was guilty or innocent, where a person was subjected to painful and often deadly tests. The most common form of trial by ordeal was called trial by fire, where a person would be placed in the middle of a fire. If they emerged from the flames unharmed, they were innocent, but if they were burned, they were guilty. Other forms of trial by ordeal included trial by water, where a person would be tied up and thrown into a lake. If they floated, they were guilty, and if they sank, they were innocent. And trial by hot water, where a red-hot musket ball was dropped down a person's throat. If they swallowed the ball, they were innocent. If they spit it out, they were guilty. Needless to say, the odds were stacked against the poor people who had to endure these trials. 1. Women could only appear in court with permission. In modern society, women's rights are slowly but surely increasing. But back in the days of the Vikings, women's rights were pretty much non-existent. If a woman wanted to appear in court, she had to get permission from her father or husband. In most cases, they wouldn't grant her permission, meaning that women couldn't speak on their own behalf in court. If a woman was summoned to court, she would have to send a male relative in her place. And if that person didn't show up, the court would assume that the woman was guilty. Women were also prohibited from testifying in court, meaning that their voices were never heard in matters involving the law. And if that's not enough evidence of how poorly women were treated by the Vikings, we don't know what is. Do you know any other brutal Viking laws that we didn't mention in this video? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like these.